He walked into the fort with no weapon in hand, only words, a leader who wanted peace, and a people who didn't want to listen. What happened next would be buried beneath centuries of silence until the land itself began to speak. In Point Pleasant, West Virginia, a strange figure with glowing red eyes began to appear. It watched, it warned, and after it came, people died. A bridge collapsed, a town panicked. And yet, few ever asked, where did the fear begin? Was the Mothman just a monster? Or was it the shadow of something much older, something the country chose to forget? If you enjoy uncovering the hidden truths behind America's legends, subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share your thoughts in the comments. It helps this project stay alive and growing. This isn't just a story about a creature. It's the story of a man betrayed, a land cursed, and a legacy silenced. And once you understand the real history behind the legend, you may never see it the same way again. Chief Cornstalk was not the image most Americans have when they think of the so-called savage Indian from history books. He was eloquent, tall, calm-eyed, and tired of blood. As a leader of the Shawnee during a time of relentless frontier violence, Cornstalk chose dialogue when others demanded war. Stories say he walked into colonial forts not with weapons, but with open hands and eyes that held centuries of wisdom. He warned of coming storms, not for revenge, but because he believed peace could be stronger than power. For a brief moment, it seemed his vision might win. He had just fought in Lord Dunmore's war and seen too many warriors die. Though the Shawnee were fierce, Cornstalk knew the numbers weren't on their side. He urged his people to hold the land with words, not arrows. His speech at treaty councils was so powerful that even his enemies respected him. "I am the man," he said, "who holds back the storm." To settlers, he became a curious symbol of hope. But to other Shawnee, his restraint felt dangerous. What if peace was just delay? What if silence became surrender? And Cornstalk, with all his noble talk, began to stand alone. Still, he kept speaking. When the American Revolution stirred chaos across the colonies, Cornstalk once again warned the British and American sides. Do not pull us into this fire. His people were caught in the middle, forced to choose between two foreign empires. Cornstalk offered neutrality, a dangerous choice in wartime. He traveled to Fort Randolph in 1777, not with warriors, but with his son and two others, hoping to keep the frontier calm. He believed that if the white men saw his sincerity, they would respect it. But even as he spoke, the trap was already set. What Cornstalk didn't know was that fear had begun to twist minds on both sides. Colonists saw every native as a possible threat. Rumors flew that the Shawnee would attack, despite Cornstalk's words. Soldiers at Fort Randolph hesitated. They saw him as too powerful, too clever. If he wasn't their ally, he must be their enemy. So they locked him inside the fort for safety, their safety, not his. Cornstalk tried to remain calm, but his eyes, once steady, began to reflect unease. He had stepped into the lion's mouth, and now the teeth were closing. He still believed they would not harm him. Even in prison, he explained reason pleaded. He believed the power of his character could protect him, that being noble was enough. But Cornstalk had miscalculated one thing. The settlers were no longer listening. They weren't looking at a man. They were looking at a symbol they feared. And symbols are easier to destroy than to understand. In that moment, Cornstalk's fate was sealed not by who he was, but by what he represented. He had walked into the fort for peace, but the door had closed behind him. Cornstalk's imprisonment might have seemed temporary, a political measure during a chaotic time. But behind the wooden walls of Fort Randolph, whispers grew louder. Word spread among the soldiers. Rumors of Shawnee attacks, sightings of warriors in the woods, shadows moving where none should. Fear, once vague and formless, began to take shape. Some believed Cornstalk's visit wasn't a gesture of peace, but reconnaissance. The man who spoke with such calm must be hiding something. And in times of war, the line between caution and cruelty blurs quickly. Unknown to Cornstalk, a secret letter had been circulated days before. It suggested that eliminating native leaders might prevent future uprisings. Though not an official order, it planted an idea. Some settlers were growing impatient. Their families had been killed in past raids, and many didn't care if Cornstalk was innocent. They wanted someone to pay. He walks like a man of peace, one journal noted, but he walks too freely for my liking. These quiet prejudices began to rot the foundation of the fragile peace. Cornstalk's eloquence, once admired, now felt threatening. He wasn't just a prisoner. He was a liability. Outside the fort, tensions exploded. A militiaman was killed in a skirmish miles from the post. No evidence linked to Shawnee. But rage doesn't need facts, only fire. Enraged, a group of soldiers stormed Cornstalk's cell. They didn't wait for orders, didn't ask questions. They shot him point blank as his son leapt forward to defend him, the air filled with the sound of muskets and betrayal. Cornstalk's body fell to the floor, riddled with bullets. His son's scream was silenced by gunfire. And just like that, the voice of peace was erased in a flurry of cowardice. Before he died, Cornstalk spoke one final time. Witnesses say his voice didn't tremble. He raised his head and pronounced a curse, not of revenge, but of eternal unrest. "I was your friend," he said, "but you have murdered me." He warned that the land would never know peace again. Some soldiers scoffed, others stood silent, but none forgot those words. Decades later, strange events began to haunt the land around Point Pleasant. Floods, fires, suicides, and eventually, something even more disturbing. Sightings of a winged figure watching from the trees. Those events would come later. But in that moment, after the gunshots echoed through the fort, the silence was heavier than any voice. The soldiers looked at each other, unsure. They hadn't just killed a man, they had shattered a bridge. That night, the sky above the Kanawha River darkened unnaturally early. And in that darkness, a story began to form. One that wouldn't end with Cornstalk's death. It would twist and grow, echoing in nightmares, whispered in families, and inscribed in the bones of the land. After Cornstalk's murder, Point Pleasant tried to move on, but something in the soil had changed. Locals claimed the air near Fort Randolph felt colder, as if the land itself recoiled from what had happened. Birds avoided the trees around the site. Fishermen reported unnatural stillness in the water. And then came the dreams, dark figures watching from doorways, whispers in forgotten tongues, a presence that could not be named. Most dismissed it as guilt or coincidence. But the Shawnee knew, to them, Cornstalk was more than a leader. His death without justice had broken a sacred balance. In the years that followed, tragedies accumulated with eerie precision. In 1907, a water plant explosion killed 3 men not far from the site of Cornstalk's death. In 1913, the river flooded, destroying homes and killing dozens. A massive chemical spill in the 1940s left a whole section of forest dead for years. Some incidents had logical explanations, but others didn't. People began calling the area cursed. And still, no one spoke Cornstalk's name aloud. He had faded from textbooks, but not from memory. The curse, it seemed, didn't require belief, only silence. And that silence was everywhere. Then came the sightings. In 1966, gravediggers in Point Pleasant saw something they couldn't explain. A tall, winged creature with glowing red eyes, hovering near the cemetery. Days later, 2 couples claimed it chased their car down a rural road, flying without effort. More reports followed, from soldiers, students, even police. The creature was soon called the Mothman. It wasn't violent, but its appearance always preceded disaster. In 1967, the Silver Bridge collapsed, killing 46 people. Survivors swore they'd seen glowing eyes in the fog. The government investigated the structural failure, but locals knew the truth ran deeper. Whispers of Cornstalk's curse returned. Researchers began to connect the dots. The creature's territory aligned with historic Shawnee lands. The events always centered near the old fort site. Some even believed Mothman wasn't a monster, but a guardian, a warning, or the curse itself made flesh. A consequence of history, refusing to stay buried. One professor described it as a psychological scar on the land, manifesting physically. Others dismissed it as hysteria. But the fear persisted, because if the curse was real, then every tragedy was part of an old wound, reopening again and again. The town of Point Pleasant tried to reclaim the narrative, turning Mothman into a mascot, a festival, a statue. But beneath the celebration was tension. The land still carried unease. Tourists came for the thrill, But residents remembered the funerals, the bridge collapse, the missing pets, the eyes in the woods. They wondered if burying the truth in bronze had only made it angrier, and if Cornstalk's words, spoken in dignity, in fury and betrayal, had taken root not as a myth but as a force that waits, silent, until it's seen again. The deeper one looks into the Cornstalk curse, the less it resembles a fairy tale, and more a pattern of silence, symbols, and selective memory. The Shawnee believed that every death had weight, that land remembers. Fort Randolph wasn't just a military post. It became a wound left open, never truly sealed. Locals report odd weather shifts around the site. Even today, sudden winds, unnatural stillness before storms, animals avoiding the grounds. Spiritualists speak of residual pain, the kind that stains reality itself. Perhaps the curse doesn't seek vengeance. Perhaps it's just a reminder, refusing to let the past be erased. The symbols surrounding the Mothman align disturbingly well with indigenous warnings. Red eyes, often a sign of a spirit displaced. Wings, not freedom, but a burden carried through dimensions. Even the timing of appearances, before disasters, fits within indigenous lore of omen spirits. The creature may not be a monster at all, but a silent judge, a mirror to the wrongs committed centuries ago. And every time someone tries to reduce it to myth or marketing, it returns, more visible, more terrifying. It's not here to entertain. It's here to be remembered. Many believe Cornstalk's final words weren't a curse, but a prophecy, that injustice echoes until acknowledged. Historians often omit his speech, but descendants, oral storytellers, and tribal elders remember. They speak of his restraint, his warnings, and the betrayal that shattered his spirit. In that context, the curse becomes less supernatural and more psychological, a community haunted by its inability to reckon with what it did. The Mothman becomes a silhouette of suppressed guilt, flapping through fog, disrupting sleep, refusing to fade. The curse, then, isn't his, it's ours. What haunts Point Pleasant isn't just a winged figure. It's the silence that followed a noble man's murder. Generations grew up hearing about Mothman, but never about Cornstalk. The festival celebrates fear, but not the history behind it. And maybe that's why the fear lingers. Because what isn't said becomes louder. What isn't taught becomes twisted. And what isn't healed continues to infect. The curse doesn't chase people down roads. It sits quietly in their schools, their cemeteries, their memories. It doesn't need to scream. We do that ourselves. And if that's true, then breaking the curse doesn't require rituals or offerings. It requires acknowledgement, naming Cornstalk, telling his story, admitting what was done. That's the part no one wants to do, because it's easier to fear a monster than to face a mirror. So Point Pleasant continues to watch the trees. They listen for wings. But perhaps what they're truly afraid of is what they might hear if they finally listen to the land. To walk the fields near old Fort Randolph today is to feel a quiet that doesn't belong. It's not the peaceful silence of nature, but something heavier, like a held breath that never exhales. Locals still report strange phenomena. Electronic interference near the old site, sudden temperature drops, lights flickering in abandoned buildings. Most don't mention Cornstalk. His name feels lost beneath layers of folklore and fear. But the land hasn't forgotten. Every tree, every stone carries an echo, and some say that when the wind moves just right, it still sounds like someone warning of a storm. Modern Point Pleasant leans into its mystery. Souvenir shops sell Mothman mugs, and tourists pose beneath the statue's wings. But beneath the surface, there's a fracture, a community profiting off a myth while ignoring its root. The bridge collapse, the sightings, the strange deaths, all linked by invisible threads to a single moment of betrayal. The story that haunts this town is not about a monster. It's about a murder and the silence that followed. What lives in the shadows of Point Pleasant may not be the curse of Cornstalk, but our refusal to say his name. Because that's the real horror. How easy we replace truth with spectacle. Cornstalk was a man flawed, dignified, betrayed. He stood for peace in a world that wanted war. He tried to hold back history's tide and was swallowed by it. And now his legacy has been reduced to a footnote beneath glowing red eyes. But history doesn't forget, even when we do. And sometimes It finds ways to remind us, with visions in the night, with bridges collapsing, with legends we don't fully understand. Perhaps the curse isn't punishment, but a plea to listen, to remember, to honor what was lost. Maybe Mothman isn't a demon, but a symbol, a sign that this land still aches, that it hasn't healed, that the truth still waits to be spoken aloud. Because until we speak it, until we face what was done, the stories will keep repeating, and the silence will keep whispering, not out of malice, but out of memory. So the next time you see red eyes in the dark, or feel the wind shift unexpectedly, pause. Think of Cornstalk, the peacekeeper who walked into a trap believing in dialogue. Think of the curse that followed, and ask yourself, what stories are we still bearing? What truths have we dressed up as myths to sleep better at night?